Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Haley if you are new, and I make videos all about life with chronic illness. So if you like that type of content, subscribe down below. And today, as you can see, I have a special guest.
Hello.
This is my mom, Carrie. Figured I should probably introduce her. No, she's this random lady I found off of Craigslist.
Yes, you did find me on Craigslist.
And today we are going to be talking about questions pertaining to my diagnosis journey. I thought it would be a good video to put online to share because I think diagnosing needs to be more prominent than it is of less common conditions.
I agree.
Okay, so the first question is, what was the very first thing that tipped you off in my entire life that there was something wrong with me?
It was probably when I was pregnant, and I want to say I was about 26 to 28 weeks pregnant with you, and because your sister had a heart condition, the doctor wanted me to go get an echocardiogram, which I didn't even realize at the time you could do if you were pregnant. To the baby, so I went and had that done, and the doctor said you had a very large ventricular septal defect in your heart.
So can you say that in layman's terms?
So she had a very large hole in her heart, and they told me she would most likely need surgery right after she was born. And then my doctor, my OBGYN, called me a couple of days later and said, well, a certain percentage of children that have this in utero also have a neurotube defect, so she wanted me to get an amniocentesis done. And so they said that no, there was no abnormalities, that she was fine, and so I was able to give birth at our local hospital. And when she was born, God miraculously healed her heart, and she didn't have not even a little murmur or anything. And so, but because my older daughter had had a heart defect, and because she had apnea as a result of that, and with Haley's diagnosis, I refused to leave the hospital without an apnea monitor. And I think that was just God kind of whispering in my ear, because it wasn't soon after we brought her home that the apnea monitor started going off. And at first, her pediatrician just kept saying, well, it's probably because the settings are wrong, we need to adjust the settings. And when she was about 6 weeks old, after a long episode of the apnea monitor alarming one night, it was like alarming all night long, it wouldn't stop, we were put into, which is a local hospital near us, and she went and she had a sleep study done, and that was pretty rough because I was nursing her at the time and she was all hooked up, so I couldn't even pick her up.
I was how old?
6 weeks old. And so I had to you know, I stayed in the hospital with her overnight, and I noticed that the person kept coming in and he kept telling me everything was okay, and 2 days later they called and said she's being admitted to the hospital because she had 40 bouts of sleep apnea that night,
which is 40 times of stopping
breathing, or bradycardia, which is her heartbeat would go really low. And so, and her heartbeat would go down to like 20 beats a minute. So they put us in the hospital. We were in there for a week. She had lots of studies and MRIs, and they couldn't figure out what was wrong other than she had central sleep apnea. So they sent us home on theophylline, which is a bronchodilator. So it like helps her to be able to breathe.
Oh, I remember. Is this what we...
Yeah, we affectionately called it baby speed because her eyes would dilate and she'd get all like, wah, you know, and she wouldn't, and she went 36 straight hours without sleeping.
Don't look at me, I don't remember that.
And just happy, and she was just happy. So that was rough. And then she always seemed to kind of just miss her developmental milestones. So like she didn't sit up until after she was a year old. She didn't walk until she was 16 months old. So it wasn't like she was grossly behind, but just slightly behind, just enough that was a concern. And when she was about 14, 15 months old, we'd been going to a neurologist because of the sleep apnea and because of some other issues. And they thought that she had mild cerebral palsy because she would only use like one arm to crawl on. She was stronger on one side. And that was not the case. And I kept thinking all along, like, all of these things were connected, and the doctors would all say, no, they're not. And during this time as well, like every, say, 5 to 6 months, she would have these bouts of what we thought was the stomach flu. She would...
Spoiler, it wasn't.
She would get really sick and vomit, and nobody else would get it in the house. And so as time progressed, and she started seemingly to catch up to her peers in her physical aspects, like walking, running, all of that, she started around 3 or 4, really the cyclic vomiting really started kicking in. And that's when she started vomiting every, oh gosh, probably like every 3 to 4 months regularly. And it was always, I remember always on Thanksgiving, when she had some stressor, and Christmas. Those were big ones that she always. And we would be admitted in the hospital because she would go into what they call an awake coma, which she's not in a coma, but she's completely lethargic, and it would be after the first time she vomited. So she would have the pallor, which she would look dead, her eyes would be sunken in, she would get totally white as a sheet, her lips were purpley blue, and she was completely out of it. And she didn't remember anything that happened during it. So they thought she might have been having seizures. They were convinced when she was 4 it was her kidneys, because she did have kidney reflux because her dad had reflux. And she had kidney surgery at 4. That didn't help. We were back in the hospitals not soon after that. And right around that time, her pediatrician said, you know, I had this patient several years ago that had this thing called cyclic vomiting syndrome. I think Haley might have that. So we went back to a different neurologist in the same clinic, and he diagnosed her with that. And we started going to a support group, and that's where we met her doctor. And you can insert the picture. You should, like...
I think I might just hold it up for them.
So this is Cyclic Vomiting Syndrome Association, and a support group meeting that we used to go to when Haley was about 4.
This man right here is my doctor. So, and then I'm right here, little itty bitty Haley, and that was the family support meeting. And that is how...
That is the very first day we met the good doctor. And I said, I don't know what I have to do, but my daughter has to see him. And that's when he was practicing at a hospital. Now he's in private practice. Yeah.
But he was also talking about correlation with mitochondrial disease.
With mitochondrial disease, and that was the first time we'd heard that. And people were talking about the MITO cocktail, and we were like, well, what is that? You give your 4-year-old a cocktail?
No, it's just a bunch of meds mixed together.
And so we wound up seeing him about 6 to 8 months later, and he diagnosed her with mitochondrial disease. And we didn't want to have a muscle biopsy done because that's the definitive diagnosis of that. We felt like the treatment wasn't going to change, that he was going to treat her the same regardless of what she had or didn't have. So at that point, we just treated her as she did have it, which she does have it.
I do have it.
So that seemed to, like, we thought, cure her of her CVS. And from the age of like 6 till 11, 12-ish, she had no symptoms. She seemed to always be a little bit weaker than her peers. She seemed to always have a very difficult time. The one that sticks out in my mind is the first time we went to Washington, D.C., and she cried the entire time walking around. She kept telling us her knees hurt. And we were like, what is wrong with this kid? She should be fine. She should be able to keep up. This was before we knew she needed a wheelchair at all.
Yeah. So in 2012, which was the year after Utah, I was 11. And to give you just a brief summary of what was going on over the period of 2 months basically, was I got the stomach flu. I went to the homeschool convention near us all day, like early in the morning to late afternoon.
I think that was 2012.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about when I relapsed.
Sorry.
It's okay. And then we went on a 2-week vacation. With that time, like we said, mentioned, we didn't know I needed a wheelchair, so, and I got sick. I was sick the entire 2 weeks. And on top of that, that year kind of started the onset of puberty, so all of that came together and basically exploded.
But it did come back because it was like once every couple of months, and then once a month, and then it went to once every couple of weeks that she was in and out of the hospital.
And I lost a lot of weight. And then that's when I started using a wheelchair.
And that's when she started using a wheelchair, and when we had to start increasing medications. And then the next February is when you were, February or March, when you were diagnosed with complex regional pain, right?
It was February. Yeah, I was hospitalized for like 2 days because
she couldn't use her legs anymore, and they were really painful, and her hands were swollen and painful. The doctor at that time increased her medications, and then it was a few months later, or the following year, that you were diagnosed with hemiplegic migraines.
It was May when I was diagnosed with hemiplegic migraines, because there's also, anyways.
And so that's when we started noticing, like, she had trouble walking, she had trouble speaking, she couldn't, she would want to say stuff like, open the door, and would be like, walk the cat. She couldn't, like, one side of her face started drooping, one side of her eyes started drooping, and we started really panicking, and her doctor had us come in, and that's when he diagnosed her with hemiplegic migraines, and that's when he put her on arginine, which is
honestly a lifesaver, because without that,
but a really high dose,
like a really
high dose, like a ridiculous high dose. So, and then it seemed like things kind of leveled out, and we thought we were, you know, I mean,
I still experienced symptoms. It wasn't like I was symptom free, but over the course of 2 years, I built my endurance. And then in January of 2016, I made a mistake, because, I mean, everyone makes them.
Yes, and she wanted to be a regular kid and not have issues and go with her friends, and she didn't want to take a wheelchair, and she was
almost passed out
passed out because she was just getting over a cold as well.
No, that was the morning I woke up with a cold, and I didn't tell you because I knew you would keep me home.
And so that started our downward spiral in 2016.
Because
and
sickness for me triggers my conditions.
And so that's the year she almost died, and we almost lost her, and she was diagnosed with postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, and it was a coalescence of a CVS episode, which is extremely rare. So anything that's extremely rare or complicated, that's this girl. So that's basically our diagnosis history, and I didn't go over the times where, you know, she was younger, like 3 or 4, in and out of the hospital, and we had nurses asking us if she could have gotten into poison, or the doctor testing us for heavy metals because they thought we might have poisoned her, or doctors just flat out not believing you,
telling you it's all in your head,
or telling you it's because you're homeschooled and you're depressed and you should take a dance class and hang out with your friends more.
If you want to know what that story is, go watch my last video. I'll put it up and the cards up above.
And yeah, lots of different doctors that don't believe you, or if you go to a emergency room, a world-renowned emergency room, and you take a letter from your doctor, because if you have mitochondrial disease, you'll already know you need a ER letter that states how you should treat these patients, and they read it and don't listen to it and Google it and find out that the doctor was right to begin with, and then still don't listen to it
because they're too stubborn to tell. There's awesome doctors,
yes, and there's not so awesome doctors,
and there are doctors in hospitals that get really, really annoyed when your doctors aren't in the hospital.
And they have like a who's better at this than me contest, and it's really kind of ridiculous when it's your kid that's sitting there sicker than a dog trying to get them to listen to you. So that's basically our overview of, you know, our road to diagnosis. I would highly suggest, if you're having problems getting a diagnosis, that you just keep pursuing doctors, and if somebody won't listen to you, go somewhere else. Go to another state if you have to.
I guess my doctors are not close to us at all, but
don't just take what one doctor has when you know in the back of your mind that there's something else going on. Really listen to your inner voice, especially if you're a mom and you're like, what, you know.
Yeah, moms have a very strong instinct.
I knew something else was going on with her, and
you were right.
It took many years. It was many years, and it was still
5 years total for the mitochondrial disease and CVS diagnosis, and then everything else kind of was added on.
All right, well, thanks guys, thanks for watching, and keep up the good fight.
Thank you guys. Okay, sorry, say that again. I wasn't
Keep on fighting.